In this video, we are going to be talking about data blending in Tableau. And data blending is very similar to join, so I'm going to take a few seconds to explain to you the difference between join and data blending. With join, you are combining two data frames into one. With data blending, you are using data sets from two separate data sources in your visualization. With data blending, you need a column in common, but that column needs to be a dimension, not a measure. And with data blending, the first data source you use in the view is called the primary data source, and everything else is a secondary data source. And all of this will make sense in a second as I show you how to do data blending in Tableau. Let's dive in. So in Tableau, you already know how to connect to a data source, but in this case, I'm going to show you how to connect to multiple data sources at the same time. So I have this data source right here. To add more data sources to it, there's a couple of ways you can do it. So when you click on, let me show you something real quick, something you need to know. From here, when you click on Sheet, as you can see, this data source is automatically used, and that's because you have cells right here. When you take cells out and you go back to Sheet, as you can see, you have this red icon right here, and there's nothing in dimensions and measures. If you use this connection button to click on Add, the new data source that you added will be right here under this exact same data source connection. So this is basically a new connection to a different data frame, but all using the same data source connection. So what does this mean? If you go to Sheet, this Excel sheet that's right here is what will show up right here. And if you take it out, it doesn't show up right here. And if you click on this, you only have one data source right here. And when you go back to your data source, this right here serves as a single data source. And within this data source, you can have multiple sheets or multiple data frames, if that makes sense. One way to add a new data source is to, let me go ahead and remove this real quick so it doesn't get confusing. So we have cells here. One way to add a new data source is to click this button, and from here you click on new data source. So now you have a new data source, right? When you click this drop down, you can switch between your two data sources, and within each data source you can add more and more things to this data source. Why does this matter? Why does how you add your new data source matter? It matters when you come to your sheet. When we go to Sheet right now, as you can see, we have two separate data sources and not just one. And if we go back to this one and take these cells here, now this doesn't have the red exclamation mark anymore. Another way to add a data source is to use this data button right here and then click on new data source. And once you do that, your new data source is added right here. And you can come from this and you can switch between your different data sources. And when you go to your sheet, you see your three different data sources. So make sure when you want to do data blending, you are using this button right here to do your new data source, or this button right here. If you just add a connection to an existing data source, in theory, this connection that you add is a different data source, but it behaves differently in Tableau when you add the connection, when you add a new data source from this button. The relationship changes a little bit. So now let's move on to data blending. Like I said, with data blending, the data sets have to have something in common, but what they have in common has to be a dimension. It cannot be a measure. Okay? And whatever you bring into the view first serves as your primary data source. So if I click on this, these are like the dimensions available to me. Now if I bring membership code into the view, for example, as you can see, it gets a blue check mark. This blue check mark is an indication that this is your primary data source. Now when I go to club membership, as you can see, club membership has a red icon. This red icon means there's a link between this data source right here and this data source. Now if I go back here and let's say family members to text, now you can see how many family members belong to each membership code. And I can also drag this to add this here. You can see how long they have been a member. And as you can see, this information, family members and members since, is coming from, let me extend this a little bit. These two columns right here, this information is coming from this data source, while membership code is coming from this data source. And this orange check mark indicates that this is the secondary data source. So right now, membership code is being used as the linking source. That's why you have this red mark right here. Now let's duplicate our sheet and just call this sheet 2. Now you see, now when you go to this data source called cells, you see first name, ID, and last name. You could use first name as the linking. So basically, if you go here, you see first name and last name, and this is the primary data source. So we can link this data source with this data source just by clicking this button. Now these two data sources are linked together. All right. And let's say we can grab something like total sales per family member and add it here. And you can see this information. From here, you can see that this data source is the primary data source because we brought it into the view first. And this are the secondary data sources. Now we can duplicate this and let's call this sheet 3. And let's go ahead and clear our view. And let's say, for example, let's use this one as the primary data source. We can bring first name and then last name into the view. So now this data source has a blue icon, and this blue icon indicates that this is being used as the primary data source. Now we can go to club membership. As you can see, you don't see any linking icon. That's because sales and club membership doesn't have any dimensions in common. But when we go to sales by members, you can see that sales and sales by members have first name and last name in common, and both of them are being used to link this data source to this data source. Now from here, I could bring total sales into the view, and everything will be fine. So now I'm using sales by members as secondary data source, and I'm taking sales from this data source and first name and last name from this data source. Now if I go to club membership and let's say try to drag this into the view, let's see what will happen. It throws an error. It tells us in order to use fields from this membership, there needs to be a relationship between cells, between club membership and the primary data source. So that didn't work. It didn't pulling data from this into the view didn't work because there's no connection between this data source and the primary data source. Bringing something like membersys into the view breaks everything. So we need to take this out. So basically that is how you blend different data sources. Whatever you bring into the view first acts as a primary data source, and if you see this red icon highlighted, that means they are connected. That means the other data source is connected to the primary data source. And you can, whenever you see this link, that means you can make connection between the secondary data source and the primary data source using these dimensions. And since first name, last name, membership club code is located in the primary data source, we could create a visualization from all three data sources as long as the primary data source can be connected to the other data sources. And in this situation, our primary data source is cells, and it has dimensions in common with cells by members, so we were able to create visualization using these two data sources. But the primary data source doesn't have anything in common, doesn't have any dimensions in common with club membership, so we were not able to bring any dimensions or measures from club membership into the view. I hope this makes sense, and I hope you learn how to blend data from different data sources in Tableau. That's it for this video, and I'll see you on the next one.